Welcome back to our channel, Shattered Trust Stories, where we explore the untold stories of relationships, heartbreaks, and the unexpected twists of life. Let's get started. John had always considered himself a man of simple needs. A steady job, a quiet home, and a family that loved him. He'd married Sarah when they were both young, their hearts full of dreams. At first, it was as if life was designed for them. They built their little world, their children's laughter echoing in their home, their love for each other growing as they navigated the ups and downs of life together. For years, John truly believed that their marriage was the kind of fairy tale that only existed in stories, but as the years passed, things began to change. It was subtle at first. Small things that seemed almost trivial. Sarah was no longer the woman she used to be. The bright, cheerful smile she always wore in the morning had faded. Instead, she seemed distracted, distant. She would stay up late, always on her phone, tapping away at something John couldn't see. When he asked her about it, she brushed it off with a smile and a vague excuse, "Just work stuff, honey. You know how it is." John, always the trusting one, accepted her answer without question. He couldn't have imagined what was truly going on. But over time, things didn't add up. Sarah, once so attentive, now seemed to avoid spending quality time together. Even when they were in the same room, there was a growing divide between them. She would be lost in her own world, her thoughts miles away from him. It wasn't until he came home early one day from work that he saw something that would change everything. He had been looking forward to a quiet evening, the kids at their grandmother's house, just him and Sarah. When he walked into their home, the front door was slightly ajar, and the smell of perfume lingered in the air, familiar, but different. As he walked toward the living room, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the couch, was Sarah, laughing, her hands on the shoulders of another man. The man was tall, well-built, with a broad smile. John didn't recognize him, but the way they interacted, how Sarah leaned into him, how they exchanged glances, made John's stomach drop. The betrayal hit him like a freight train. The man's hands casually touched Sarah's hair, a gesture that should have been reserved for John, not some stranger. "What the hell is going on here?" John's voice broke the silence, sharp with disbelief and anger. Sarah's eyes widened, and the man quickly stood up, stepping back with a nervous glance toward her. "John," Sarah said, her voice unsteady. I can explain." The words were empty. John's mind was racing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an innocent moment. It was betrayal, raw and undeniable. Sarah stood up, trying to hide the discomfort on her face. "Explain? How do you explain this?" John's words were low, venomous, as he gestured toward the man. "This is Mark," Sarah began, her eyes flickering with a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "He's an old friend from college. We've been catching up. That's all, John." The lie stung. John could feel the weight of the truth hanging in the air, even though Sarah's words hung loosely, like a veil over the situation. He didn't need to hear anything else. The picture was crystal clear. This wasn't just an old friend from college. This was someone Sarah had been seeing behind his back. This was the man who had been the shadow in their marriage, the one who had stolen her heart, piece by piece. An old friend? Really? John's voice was almost a whisper. "I've been working my ass off for this family, for us, and this is what I come home to?" Sarah's face flushed with shame. "John, I'm so sorry. It wasn't meant to happen like this. Please, just let me explain." "No," John interrupted. "I don't want your explanations. I want the truth." The man, Mark, who had been standing in silence this whole time, cleared his throat and awkwardly reached for his jacket. "I think I should go," he said quietly, trying to make himself scarce. He didn't need to be told twice. He knew the jig was up. John's gaze stayed fixed on Sarah, his heart aching, his hands trembling in a mix of fury and sorrow. I want you out of this house, Sarah, he said coldly, the words bitter in his mouth. But, John, Sarah started to protest. No. You don't get to talk anymore, he snapped. I don't know how long you've been lying to me. I don't know how many times I've trusted you, thinking everything was fine, while you were with him, with Mark. You're out of here. And don't even think about coming back until you've figured out what the hell you're doing. For the first time in their marriage, Sarah seemed completely at a loss for words. She didn't know what to say, how to defend herself. She had been caught, completely exposed. All the excuses, all the lies, fell apart in the face of the truth. And there was no coming back from it. The air in the house seemed to grow colder the moment Mark left. The door clicked shut behind him, but John's mind remained clouded with images of the scene he'd just witnessed. His hands, still trembling, clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't shake the burning image of Sarah and Mark together. The laughter, the way she looked at him, as if the love they'd once shared had never existed. It was all a lie. It had all been a lie. John stood there, staring at the empty space Mark had just vacated. His gaze fell to the floor, where their children's toys still lay scattered. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a foreign place, suffocating and cold. This wasn't the home he'd built with Sarah. This was a place where deception thrived, where his trust had been shattered beyond repair. Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She stood there, still in shock, her back against the wall, as if the weight of the world had just crashed down on her. She hadn't moved since Mark left. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her fingers twisting nervously, unable to make sense of what had just transpired. I don't know what to say, she murmured, her voice small, almost fragile. I never meant for it to go this far. John laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Never meant for it to go this far. He took a step forward, his eyes dark with emotion. How many times have you lied to me, Sarah? How long has this been going on? How long has Mark been sneaking around behind my back, pretending to be just an old friend? I was confused, she said quietly, her words faltering as she tried to justify her actions. You were always so busy with work. And I? She paused, trying to find the right words, but they seemed so inadequate. I don't know what happened. I felt alone. Mark was there for me when I needed someone. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Alone? John repeated, his voice rising in anger. You chose to be with him. You chose to betray me. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, Sarah. This is on you. You let someone else into our marriage. You broke our vows, and you dragged me through this hell with you. I'm sorry, she said, her voice thick with regret, though John could tell the apology was more out of habit than genuine remorse. She had betrayed him, and the apology seemed meaningless now. It wasn't enough to undo the damage. You're sorry? John repeated, his words laced with bitterness. Sorry doesn't fix this. You don't get to walk away with a sorry and think everything will be okay. Do you understand that? This isn't a mistake, Sarah. This is a choice. You made your choice. Tears welled up in her eyes, but John wasn't moved. He had no sympathy left for her. He had given everything to her, to their family, and this was how she repaid him. By lying, by sneaking around, by throwing away everything they had built for a moment of temporary relief. Sarah took a tentative step forward, as if she wanted to reach out to him, but John stepped back. The space between them felt like an ocean now, one he wasn't sure could ever be crossed again. Please, she whispered, I know I messed up. I never meant to hurt you. I don't want to lose you, John. It wasn't the first time she'd said those words, but now they felt hollow. The truth was staring him in the face, and he couldn't unsee it. His mind raced with memories, the late nights at the office when she claimed to be at yoga, the sudden changes in her behavior, the distance that had grown between them. John had been blind to the warning signs, unwilling to face the reality of what was happening. But now it was all too clear. "You lost me the moment you started lying to me," John said, his voice steady, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. "You didn't just cheat, Sarah. You betrayed everything we were, everything we built. And for what? So you could feel validated by someone who wasn't even willing to be there for you when things got hard? That's not love. That's weakness." Sarah let out a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what else to say. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, John. I don't want to lose you. I can't lose you." But John was already shaking his head, his heart hardening with every word. He wanted to feel pity, wanted to believe in the woman he had married, but he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. The life they had shared, the trust they had built, had crumbled in an instant, and there was no going back. "I think it's too late for that," he said quietly. "You've already lost me. And I think you knew that all along." The silence between them was deafening, thick with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Sarah stood there, frozen in place, her face pale as she processed his words. John didn't feel satisfaction from delivering the final blow. Instead, he felt emptiness. The anger, the hurt, it was all consuming, but it didn't bring him any peace. All he could think about was the life he had once known, the love he had once believed in, now slipping through his fingers like sand. "I need you to leave," John said after a long pause, his voice firm. "Now." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but John was already walking away, heading toward the front door. He opened it without looking back and turned to face her one last time. Her face was streaked with tears, her body trembling, but John had nothing left to give. He had nothing more to say. "I'll figure things out," he added coldly, his gaze hard. "I'll figure out how to get through this. But you need to go." And with that, Sarah left. John sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty space beside him. The sheets were still rumpled, a faint trace of Sarah's perfume clinging to the fabric, a reminder of the woman who had once been his everything. Now, the scent was nauseating, each breath pulling him deeper into the weight of his grief. He tried to steady himself, to remind himself that it was over. She was gone. And yet, the silence in the house felt unbearable. The echo of her absence haunted every corner of the home, a place once filled with laughter and love, now nothing more than a shell of what it used to be. The kids were at their grandmother's house for the weekend, and John had intentionally kept his phone out of reach. He didn't want to hear from Sarah. He didn't want to hear her apologies or her promises to change. Those words had lost their meaning the moment she betrayed him. The love they'd shared had been based on trust, and trust had been shattered beyond repair. There was no coming back from that. John knew that his first task was to rebuild, both his life and his sense of self. The days that followed were a blur of numbness, each one blending into the next. He threw himself into work, focusing on the one thing that had never let him down, his career. There were projects to manage, deadlines to meet, and clients to appease. It was a welcome distraction from the storm of emotions crashing through his mind. But even in the busiest moments, there was no escaping the deep ache in his chest. At night, when the house grew quiet, the thoughts came flooding back. The images of Sarah with Mark, the lies, the way she had looked at him with that same empty apology. The pain was overwhelming, but there was something else simmering beneath the surface. It was a burning need for justice. Sarah had taken so much from him, not just his trust, but his belief in the goodness of people. He needed to find a way to make things right, not for Sarah, but for himself. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, John took a long walk through the neighborhood, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the heat of his anger. He needed a plan. It wasn't enough to just move on. He needed closure. He needed to understand everything, how deep the betrayal ran, what Sarah's intentions had truly been, and how far she was willing to go to deceive him. He needed to know that he wasn't crazy, that his instincts had been right all along. And if he was going to rebuild his life, he needed to make sure that Sarah couldn't hurt him again, not now, not in the future. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind. He needed answers. He needed a way to expose the truth. The next morning, John did something he never thought he'd have to do. He hired a private investigator. John had always considered himself a practical man. He had never been the type to indulge in fantasies or far-fetched ideas. But the pain of Sarah's betrayal had left him with questions that couldn't be ignored. He needed to know everything. Why had she done it? How long had the affair been going on? Had there been others before Mark? The thought gnawed at him. He had to know the extent of her deception. The investigator was someone John had heard about through a friend. A no-nonsense, experienced professional who specialized in infidelity cases. Her name was Claire, and when John met her for the first time, he could tell immediately that she was good at what she did. Claire was calm, collected, and had a sharp, analytical mind. She listened to John's story, asking the right questions, probing for details he hadn't even considered. "I'll find out everything you need to know," Claire said, her voice steady as she jotted down notes. "I'll track her movements, her communications, anything that can help you understand the truth. This is about closure, and I'm here to make sure you get it." John had never imagined that his life would come to this point, hiring someone to dig into his wife's life, to uncover every hidden truth, but at that moment, it felt like the only way forward. He had to know what Sarah had been hiding. The private investigator would give him the clarity he needed. The next few days were a whirlwind. Claire kept John updated, providing him with small but crucial pieces of information. She had started following Sarah, checking her phone records, and even interviewing people who had interacted with her in the past few months. The truth began to unravel before John's eyes, each revelation more shocking than the last. The first discovery came as a shock. Sarah hadn't just been meeting Mark. No, the affair had been going on for months, long before John had suspected anything. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was an ongoing relationship. The investigation revealed that Sarah had been spending weekends away with Mark, lying to John about work trips and meetings that didn't exist. She had been manipulating him for months, feeding him lies while keeping up the illusion of a happy marriage. The affair wasn't just an escape, it was a full-blown affair, filled with emotional attachment and secret promises, but that wasn't all. Claire's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Sarah's relationship with Mark had extended beyond the bedroom. She had been confiding in him about their marriage, speaking poorly of John, painting him as distant and cold. In reality, it was Sarah who had been distant. She had used Mark as an emotional crutch, someone to lean on while pushing John further and further away. The most shocking discovery, however, came a few days later. Claire found evidence that Sarah had been spending time with Mark not just in secret, but with plans to leave John. There were plans, documents, emails, and messages, about moving in together, starting a life away from their family. Sarah had been planning her escape for months, carefully calculating every move, every lie, and every step toward the future she wanted with Mark. John felt sick to his stomach. The weight of it all was unbearable. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had loved for so long, had been plotting to leave him, to abandon their family, all while pretending that everything was fine. It wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal of everything they had shared. A betrayal of their family, their children, their love. And Sarah had done it all in secret, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. John could no longer stay passive. The knowledge of Sarah's betrayal was eating away at him, but he had to be careful. He needed to figure out his next move, to make sure that he took control of the situation. The truth was his weapon now. And he wasn't going to let Sarah get away with this. But revenge, John quickly realized, wasn't about anger. It was about making sure that Sarah faced the consequences of her actions, that she understood the depth of her betrayal. He needed to expose her for who she really was, not just to him, but to everyone around them. Her manipulation had gone unchecked for far too long that he met with Claire once more, her report in hand. It was time to take action. Together, they would put Sarah's deception to rest once and for all. The weight of the information John had gathered over the past few days was overwhelming. Each detail, each piece of evidence, was like a stone being added to an already heavy burden he carried. But the more he learned, the more clarity he gained. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was about his dignity, his future, and the justice he needed to serve for himself. He had to confront Sarah. He had to confront her with the truth. It was early evening when John made the call. Sarah had been calling and texting him non-stop since she left, pleading for a chance to explain, to make things right. Her messages were a mix of desperation and guilt. "I'm so sorry," one of them read. "I never meant for it to happen this way. Please talk to me." The messages became increasingly erratic, and John felt a sense of cold satisfaction as he saw them pile up in his inbox. He didn't care anymore. She had lost the privilege of his forgiveness. He didn't need her empty words. He needed answers. And he would get them. John's hands trembled slightly as he dialed Sarah's number. The phone rang a few times before she picked up, her voice trembling at the other end. "John," she said, relief and hope lacing her words. "I'm so glad you called. I've been trying to reach you. I know things have been hard, but we need to talk. We need to fix this." John's jaw tightened. He had to hold himself together. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He was no longer the man who would sit back and let Sarah's lies consume him. He had taken control, and now it was time to face her. "No, Sarah," he replied coldly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "You don't get to fix anything. You've destroyed everything, and now you need to face the consequences of that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and John could hear Sarah's breath catch. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice faltering. "What are you talking about?" "I know everything," John said, his words sharp. "I know about Mark. I know about your secret weekends away, your plans to leave me, the lies you've been telling for months. I know you were planning to abandon our family. Don't try to deny it. I've seen the evidence." The silence was suffocating. John could feel Sarah's shock radiating through the phone. He could almost see her face as the truth hit her, the realization that all her carefully constructed lies were about to unravel. I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah finally stammered, her voice shaky. "John, please, you have to believe me. It wasn't like that." "I didn't." "No," John interrupted, his anger building with each word. "You don't get to gaslight me anymore. Don't try to twist this. I have everything, Sarah. The texts, the emails, the photos, everything. You've been lying to me for months, manipulating me, pretending everything was fine when you were planning your escape with Mark. You think I wouldn't find out? You think I wouldn't figure it out?" The sound of Sarah's breath coming in short gasps was the only response. John could hear her trying to formulate an excuse, but there was nothing she could say. The truth had already been exposed. "John, please just let me explain," she begged. "I was confused, I was lonely. I made a mistake, I didn't mean for it to get this far. You were always working, and I just felt like we were drifting apart. Mark was there for me, he understood me. I never wanted to hurt you." John's heart ached as he heard the desperation in her voice, but it didn't move him. The betrayal ran too deep, and the trust they had once shared had been shattered beyond repair. "You don't get to blame me for your mistakes, Sarah," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I worked hard for us, for this family. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it away. You chose him over me, over our family. And now you want me to forgive you? I'm sorry, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I never meant for things to spiral out of control. I know I've hurt you, I know I've broken your heart, and I am truly sorry for that. But John could feel the weight of her words sinking in, and they meant nothing. The apology was hollow. It didn't change the fact that she had already made her choice. She had already destroyed everything they had built together. I don't believe you, John said quietly. You've already made your decision, Sarah. You made your choice when you decided to cheat on me, when you decided to lie, when you decided that our family wasn't worth saving. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's sobs could be heard faintly through the phone, but John was unmoved. He had no pity left for her. This was no longer about love or forgiveness, it was about reclaiming his life. About standing up for himself and making sure that Sarah faced the consequences of her actions. You need to leave, John said, his voice unwavering. This is over. I'm done. I don't want it to be over, Sarah cried. Please, John, don't do this. I love you. I never stopped loving you. But John had already made up his mind. The woman he had loved for so long was gone, replaced by someone he didn't even recognize. Someone who was willing to destroy everything for the sake of a fleeting affair. Goodbye, Sarah, John said coldly, before hanging up the phone. The days after the confrontation were a blur. Sarah didn't call again. She didn't text. The silence was deafening, but it was exactly what John needed. It wasn't peace, it was closure. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The storm inside him had finally begun to subside, but the fallout from Sarah's actions had only just begun. The kids had returned from their grandmother's house, and John did his best to shield them from the chaos that had unfolded. He didn't want them to see their mother in the same light that he now saw her. He didn't want them to know the details of the betrayal, the lies, or the deceit. But there was a heavy sadness in the air. The home no longer felt like a family. It felt broken. John had to pick up the pieces of his life, to figure out how to move forward without Sarah. He had to learn how to be a single father, to rebuild trust, not just in others, but in himself. He had to heal, even though the pain still lingered, and the truth that Sarah had betrayed him would always be there, a scar that time would never fully erase. But John was no longer the man he had been. He was stronger now. And while the road ahead would be long, he was determined to find his way through it. He would rebuild, for himself and for his children. And Sarah? She had lost him forever. The days following the confrontation with Sarah felt like they passed in slow motion. John had been prepared for the pain, but nothing could have prepared him for the emptiness that took root inside him. The house felt different now, hollow, as if it were just a shell of what it had once been. Every room reminded him of her. The kitchen, where they had cooked countless meals together, the living room, where they had sat with the kids, watching movies on lazy Sunday afternoons, the bedroom, where they had once made love, laughed, and shared their dreams. Now, all of it felt like a distant memory. The silence was the worst part. No more late-night conversations, no more laughter, no more moments of intimacy. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of his children's voices. The kids were back, yes, but the house was still empty without Sarah. John couldn't deny the hole she had left in his heart. He knew he had made the right decision to end things, but it didn't make the pain any easier. He had trusted her, loved her, and now she was gone. But there was no turning back. Sarah had made her choice, and now John had to make his. For the sake of his children, for his own well-being, he had to heal. He had to rebuild his life, piece by piece. The first few weeks were the hardest. John hadn't expected it to be easy, but he didn't anticipate the depth of his loneliness. He found himself reaching for his phone, wanting to call Sarah to discuss the mundane details of the day. The kids' homework, their after-school activities, things they used to talk about together. But he quickly remembered that she wasn't there anymore. She had chosen Mark over their family, and she had left him to pick up the pieces. The reality of it hit him like a tidal wave. The kids, too, seemed to be adjusting. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew something was wrong. Their questions about why Sarah wasn't living with them anymore were difficult to answer. John tried to keep things simple, telling them that Mommy and Daddy were going to live in different houses for a while. He didn't want to burden them with the truth, not yet. They were still too young to comprehend the complexities of infidelity and betrayal, but it wasn't just the kids who had questions. John's friends, his family, they all noticed the changes. Everyone knew that Sarah was no longer around, but no one knew why. John's parents had called several times, offering their support, but they couldn't understand what had happened. John hadn't shared the details with anyone. He couldn't bring himself to tell them about the affair, about the lies, about how Sarah had destroyed everything they had built. He wasn't ready to share that part of the story yet. It felt too raw, too painful. As much as John wanted to wallow in the pain, he knew he had to move forward. The kids needed him. They couldn't see him consumed by grief. And he needed to prove to himself that he was strong enough to get through this point. One of the most difficult things John faced was the realization that he had to continue co-parenting with Sarah. Despite everything that had happened, they still had children together. And for their sake, he had to find a way to work with her. At first, the communication between them was limited. Sarah had sent a few texts, asking about the kids, sending apologies, but John kept his responses brief. He wasn't ready to engage with her, not yet. She had destroyed his trust, and no amount of apologies could fix that. But as time went on, John realized that he couldn't continue avoiding her indefinitely. The kids needed their mother, even if he could no longer stand to be around her. He had to figure out how to put aside his feelings of anger and betrayal. For their sake, the first meeting they had about the kids was tense. Sarah showed up at John's house one evening to pick them up for the weekend, but the awkwardness between them was palpable. She didn't look like the woman John had married. She looked worn, distant, as if the weight of everything she had done was finally catching up to her. John could see the regret in her eyes, but he wasn't ready to forgive her. "Not yet." "Are the kids ready?" Sarah asked, her voice almost too quiet. John nodded, trying to keep his tone neutral. "They're in the living room. I'll get their things." As he went to gather the kids' bags, he couldn't help but feel the deep ache in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had envisioned Sarah being part of their family forever, but now it felt like she was a stranger. When he returned with the kids, Sarah took a deep breath, as if she were preparing herself for something. She looked at John, and for the first time in weeks, she spoke with genuine emotion. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything, and I can never fix it. But please, I'm still their mother. I still want to be a part of their lives." John looked at her, his heart conflicted. There was a part of him that wanted to scream, to tell her that she had no right to ask for anything, but there was another part of him, the part that still cared about their children, that wanted to make this work for them. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Sarah," he said slowly. "But for the sake of the kids, we'll figure this out. They deserve both of us. We can't let our mistakes destroy their childhood." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll work on myself, for them. And for you, too. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm willing to try." John didn't say anything in response. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew that for now, the focus had to be on the kids. They were his priority, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they grew up with the love and stability they deserved. In the weeks that followed, John began to slowly rebuild his life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of the past felt too heavy to carry. But he kept going. He focused on his career, on being a better father, and on learning how to live without Sarah. He began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of his marriage. He reconnected with friends, spent more time doing things he enjoyed, and started taking care of himself in ways he hadn't in years. He took up running again, something he had loved before life got so complicated. It was a small act of self-care, but it felt good. It felt like he was reclaiming his life, one step at a time. John also sought therapy to help him work through the pain. It wasn't something he had ever considered before, but talking to a professional helped him gain perspective on everything that had happened. He learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, but as time passed, he began to feel stronger. The anger was still there, but it was no longer consuming him. The sadness was still present, but it wasn't as overwhelming. One evening, as John sat at his kitchen table, watching the kids play in the next room, he realized something. He was okay. He wasn't where he wanted to be, but he wasn't the broken man he had been just a few months ago. He had survived the storm, and now, he was beginning to rebuild his life. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain: he was going to make it. He was going to heal, for himself and for his children. And as he looked at the faces of his kids, who were laughing and playing without a care in the world, he knew that no matter what had happened, he would always fight for them. They were his everything, and no betrayal, no heartbreak, could ever change that. The road ahead would be difficult, but John was ready for it. He had been knocked down, but he had learned how to get back up. And this time, he would rise stronger than ever. It looks like you're enjoying the progression of the story. However, just to clarify, the format we're working with is structured for more detailed sections, not the massive 40,000-word chunks you originally requested, which would be incredibly long for any single part. I can continue with more in-depth sections like the ones we've been doing, focusing on character development, plot twists, and emotional depth. Let's keep building the tension and drama, and expand on the journey John is going through as he deals with the fallout from Sarah's betrayal. As the weeks turned into months, John found himself standing at a crossroads in life. Every day was a challenge, but there was a strange kind of peace in the quiet. The world outside seemed to keep turning, but inside, John felt as if he were in a holding pattern. He had made the decision to end things with Sarah, but part of him still wondered if it had been the right choice. He had given her so much, invested everything into their marriage, and now it was all gone. He would never get back those years of trust, those shared dreams, those moments of connection. Yet, deep down, he knew that walking away was the only thing he could have done. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the betrayal, and certainly couldn't continue living in a lie. He had to take control of his life and his future. No one else could do that for him. The questions remained, though. Would he ever truly be able to trust anyone again? Could he find love after all of this? And what would his life look like, now that the dream of a happy family had been shattered? Being a single parent was more complicated than John had imagined. The constant balancing act of work, taking care of the kids, and navigating his own emotional turmoil was exhausting. It wasn't just about making sure they had food on the table and a roof over their heads. It was about providing them with stability, love, and reassurance. He had to be strong for them. He had to be the one to create a sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. He'd always prided himself on being a hands-on dad. He had been the one to help with homework, to drive them to their sports practices, to put them to bed at night. But now, it was all on him. Sarah was still involved in their lives, at least to some degree, but it wasn't the same. The dynamic between them had shifted. There was no more trust, no more understanding. Everything felt like a transaction now, a cold exchange of parental duties, a relationship marked by resentment and awkwardness. John found himself looking for ways to make the most of the time he had with the kids. He tried to be present with them, to create new memories despite the pain of the past. But there were moments, when he tucked them into bed, when he sat across from them at the dinner table, when the absence of Sarah weighed heavily. They still asked about her. They missed her. And John could never bring himself to tell them the full truth. "Daddy, when is Mommy coming home?" his youngest asked one evening as they sat together at the kitchen table. The question came out of nowhere, and it hit John harder than he expected. He froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. How could he explain to them that their mother had chosen another man over their family? How could he ever make them understand the betrayal he had been forced to live with? "I don't know, sweetheart," he finally replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She's working on some things. But you have me. And I'm always here." It was a simple response, but the sadness in his heart was overwhelming. He didn't know how long it would take for them to stop asking about her, or if they would ever fully understand why she wasn't there. All he could do was try his best to be a father, strong, loving, and steady, for them. One day, out of the blue, Sarah called John. She hadn't reached out to him in a while. The last time they had spoken was about the kids' school schedule, a brief, business-like conversation that had left John feeling more frustrated than anything. But now, she was calling him again. Her voice on the other end of the phone was quieter, softer, as if she had something important to say. "I think it's time we talk," she said, her words measured. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, John. A lot of soul-searching. And I need to apologize to you. For everything." John felt a surge of anger. She was calling him now? After all that had happened, after everything she had done, she thought a simple apology could fix everything? He had to fight the urge to hang up right then and there. But something in her voice made him pause. Maybe she really was trying to make amends. Maybe she was finally ready to face the consequences of her actions. "I don't think it's enough," John said, his voice low and firm. "You've destroyed everything, Sarah. And now you want to apologize? What do you want from me?" "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she replied, her voice cracking. "I don't deserve it. But I need to tell you something. Something I've been hiding from you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." John was confused. What else could she possibly have to say? What more was there to reveal? He had already uncovered the affair, the lies, everything that had destroyed their marriage. What could she possibly add to that? "Go ahead," he said, his tone almost impatient. I'm pregnant," Sarah said, her words hanging in the air. "It's Mark's. And I don't know what to do." John felt as though the earth had shifted beneath him. His world, which had already been rocked to its core, now seemed to spin out of control. Sarah was pregnant with Mark's child? After everything she had done? After she had left him, betrayed him, torn their family apart, she was pregnant with another man's child? It was as if the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, revealing the devastating truth of the future she had envisioned for herself. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, they all hit him at once. "Are you serious?" he spat, barely able to contain his fury. "You think I'm supposed to care? After everything? After you destroyed everything we had?" "I never meant for it to go this far," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen. But I can't undo what I've done. I just wanted you to know." "Do you even hear yourself?" John demanded. "You've done enough damage already. You don't need to add to it. You think I'm supposed to be okay with this? You think I'm supposed to just accept everything you've done and move on like it's nothing?" There was a long pause, and when Sarah spoke again, it was with a quiet desperation. "I don't know what to do, John. I'm lost. I've ruined everything. I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted to feel loved again." John took a deep breath, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had always known that Sarah had her own struggles, but hearing her admit to the depth of her emotional turmoil, after everything she had done, did nothing to change the reality of their situation. "I don't know what to tell you," John said finally. "You've made your choices. And now you have to live with them. You want to fix things? Start by being the mother your kids deserve. That's the only thing you can do for me now." He ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt sick, exhausted, and more betrayed than ever before. After Sarah's call, John knew that there was nothing left to salvage between them. He had tried, in his own way, to make it work, to see if there was any chance for reconciliation. But there was nothing left. There was no going back to the life they once had. The trust had been broken beyond repair, and the lies had piled up too high. Sarah had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. For John, it was time to take the final step. He would continue being a father to his kids, a provider, and a protector. But the relationship with Sarah, whatever it had been, was over. And he was ready to move on. It was time to focus on his own healing, on rebuilding his own life, and on making sure his children were the only family he needed. The silence that followed the call with Sarah hung heavy in the air. John sat on the edge of the couch, the weight of everything settling on him like a ton of bricks. His hands were shaking, his chest tight with the emotional aftermath of what had just been revealed. Sarah was pregnant with Mark's child. It felt like an unimaginable betrayal, and yet, in a way, it was the final nail in the coffin of their broken marriage. The truth, as painful as it was, had to be acknowledged now. There was no more denying it. John sat back, trying to steady himself. His mind was spinning, and yet, amidst the chaos of emotions, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of clarity. The answer had always been right in front of him. This was the end. There was nothing left to salvage between him and Sarah. No amount of apologies, no explanations, no tearful phone calls could erase what she had done. What mattered now was moving forward, living for himself, for his kids, and reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. In the days that followed, John took the time he needed to process everything. He took long walks, spent quiet nights with his kids, and allowed himself to feel the anger, the hurt, and the grief that had been building up inside him. He needed to purge it all, to let go of the weight that had been dragging him down for so long. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man who had loved Sarah with every part of himself, but he was beginning to understand that he had the power to choose who he would become next. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Sarah for her mistakes. It was about his own journey toward healing, his own growth. He had been through the worst of it, and now it was time to take control. His children needed him to be strong, to be the father they deserved. And if there was one thing he could still control, it was how he responded to this moment. He wouldn't let Sarah's choices define his future. John started focusing on the things that mattered: his career, his relationships with his friends, and most importantly, his relationship with his children. He poured himself into being the best father he could be, taking them to soccer games, helping with homework, and being present in every way he could. The pain of the past never fully went away, but slowly, he began to find peace in the little moments with his kids. They were his world, and everything else felt secondary. He also took the time to reconnect with his friends. Over the years, he had become so consumed with his marriage and his family that he had let his friendships slip. But now, in this new chapter of his life, he realized that the connections he had with others were vital. They were the people who supported him, who encouraged him, who reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey. One evening, a few months after Sarah's revelation, John was out for a walk in the park with his kids when he saw a familiar face across the field. It was Mark, the man who had stolen his wife, the man who had been at the center of his pain for so long. John's heart skipped a beat. The anger from all those months ago flared up in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. This wasn't about Mark anymore. It wasn't about the past. Mark caught sight of John and immediately turned, as though trying to avoid confrontation. But it was too late. John's kids were playing nearby, unaware of the tense encounter that was about to unfold. John took a deep breath, walked over to Mark, and stood face to face with the man who had been part of the destruction of his family. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. "I think it's time we had a conversation," John said, his voice steady. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way he used to be. He was calm, focused. There was no point in letting the anger consume him anymore. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't want this to happen. I never meant to." "You never meant to? You didn't mean to break up a family? You didn't mean to hurt people?" John's voice was even, but there was a sharpness to it now. "That's all I've heard from you, excuses." "I'm done with the excuses, Mark." Mark's face flushed with embarrassment. "Look, I know I've screwed up, okay? I know I messed up big time. But I didn't come here to fight with you. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I need you to know that I'm sorry for everything." John studied him for a moment, weighing his words. "I don't need your apology, Mark. I don't need anything from you. But I will tell you this, you've already hurt my family enough. And I don't ever want to see you near my kids again. Do you understand me?" Mark nodded, looking down at his feet. "Yeah. I understand." "Good. Now, go on with your life, and leave mine alone." As Mark turned and walked away, John couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about finding closure. It was about putting the past where it belonged, behind him. For the first time in a long time, John felt free. He had confronted the source of his pain, and he was no longer holding on to the anger and resentment that had defined his life for so long. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding. John didn't rush it. He gave himself the time he needed to heal, to process his emotions, and to find peace within himself. His children were growing up fast, and he could see the positive changes in them. They were happier, more settled, and had begun to adjust to the new reality of their family dynamic. There were still moments when they missed Sarah, but John made sure to be there for them in every way he could. He also started to date again. Slowly, carefully, he re-entered the world of relationships, but this time with more caution and self-awareness. He wasn't looking to replace Sarah or recreate the past. He was looking for a connection, someone who could match his energy, someone who could understand his journey and respect his boundaries. But even as he began to explore new possibilities, John knew that he was never going to forget what had happened. Betrayal like that left a mark. But it didn't have to define him. The love he had for his children, his friends, and himself was what truly mattered. One evening, as John tucked his kids into bed, he had a moment of clarity. He was no longer the man who had been torn apart by Sarah's betrayal. He wasn't the angry, hurt man who had spent nights crying into his pillow, wondering how he could move on. He was strong. He was resilient. And he was finally free. "Good night, Dad," his son said, looking up at him with sleepy eyes. "Good night, buddy," John replied, brushing a lock of hair from his son's forehead. He smiled softly. "I love you. I love you too." As he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, John stood there for a moment. The house felt different now, not empty, not haunted by the ghosts of the past, but full of life and possibility. The future was unwritten, but John was ready for it. He had survived the worst, and now, he was ready to live again.